A wealthy couple hired a surrogate who surprisingly became pregnant with twins. During genetic testing, they discovered the surrogate was actually the wife's long-lost twin sister, separated at birth. Their attempt to start a family reunited sisters who never knew they were searching for each other. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the burgeoning life within Eleanor. Her hand, trembling slightly, rested on her swollen belly. Across from her, James, his usual calm demeanor slightly frayed, squeezed her hand reassuringly. Their opulent living room, usually a testament to their success, felt suffocating tonight. Infertility, a cruel mistress, had haunted them for years, leaving a trail of dashed hopes and whispered anxieties. "Remember that clinic in Zurich?" Eleanor murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the worry etched on her face. "The one that promised miracles?" James sighed, his gaze softening. "Yes, love, and remember how we felt afterwards. Empty, devastated." He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. This time it's different. We have Sarah." The mention of Sarah, their surrogate, brought a flicker of hope to Eleanor's eyes, though a deep-seated anxiety still lingered. Sarah, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile and a quiet strength, had become a beacon of hope in their desperate journey. The thought of the child, or children, growing inside Sarah filled them with a bittersweet mix of excitement and apprehension. The weight of their expectations, of their yearning for parenthood, pressed down heavily. The ticking clock of their biological realities seemed deafening tonight. The air crackled with unspoken fears, a silent testament to the emotional roller coaster they'd endured. The journey to parenthood had been fraught with stress, and tonight, as they awaited news, it felt even more precarious. The ultrasound had revealed a surprising twins, adding another layer of complexity to their already fragile hope. The clinical white of the doctor's office felt colder than usual. Eleanor clutched James's hand, her knuckles bone-white. The silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the air conditioner, stretched taut, a living thing straining against the impending news. The doctor's face, usually pleasant, was carefully neutral, a mask concealing whatever lay behind it. "The tests are back," he finally said, his voice low. The air thickened, each breath a labored effort. Eleanor squeezed James's hand tighter, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "And?" James prompted, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. The doctor cleared his throat. "The results are quite unexpected." He paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air before he continued. "The DNA, it's a match, a near-perfect match, to Ms. Eleanor Vance." Eleanor stared, her breath catching in her throat. A match? To her? But this was Sarah's DNA, the Surrogate's. A wave of nausea washed over her, a cold dread creeping into her heart. James, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward. "To Eleanor? You mean, a close relative?" The doctor shook his head slowly. "Closer than you can imagine. Identical twin, separated at birth." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a lifetime's lost connection. Eleanor's breath hitched. Identical twin? The sheer impossibility of it all slammed into her, a physical blow. She felt a strange mixture of shock, disbelief, and a primal, almost painful longing. Years of infertility, of yearning for a child, were now intertwined with a sister she'd never known. James looked at her, his expression a mixture of concern and dawning comprehension. He gently stroked her arm. "Eleanor," he began, his voice soft but firm, offering a lifeline in the storm brewing within her. The sterile white room began to spin, the world outside fading into a blur of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. The revelation was a seismic shift, shattering the foundations of her carefully constructed life. The weight of it all pressed down, leaving her breathless, stunned into silence. The drive home was a blur. Eleanor stared out the window, the city lights a dizzying kaleidoscope. James's hand rested on her thigh, a silent comfort in the storm raging inside her. The sterile scent of the doctor's office clung to her, a bitter reminder of the bombshell dropped. "Identical twin," she whispered, the words still unbelievable. The word echoed in the quiet car, a strange and unsettling truth. James squeezed her hand. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. His unwavering support, a familiar comfort, was a stark contrast to the chaotic whirlwind in her heart. The revelation felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a sudden, violent upheaval of her carefully constructed world. A lifetime of longing, of yearning for a connection she didn't even know existed, now burst into the open. She glanced at him, noticing the subtle tightening of his jaw, the furrow in his brow. He wasn't just supporting her. He was processing it himself, grappling with the implications of this unexpected twist. He hadn't known a woman with such a significant connection to his wife's existence. The silence stretched, filled only with the hum of the car engine and the rhythmic thud of her own heart. "It's a lot to take in," she finally managed, her voice a fragile whisper. The tears threatened, a dam about to burst. She felt overwhelmed, the weight of this discovery pressing down, a crushing weight of unspoken history, of a life lived unaware of a missing piece. James pulled over to the side of the road, switching off the engine. He turned to her, his expression gentle, concerned. The streetlights cast long shadows, painting their faces in a hazy, almost ethereal light. "Tell me what you're feeling," he urged softly, his voice laced with genuine concern. His eyes, usually sparkling with life, held a depth of empathy that touched her deeply. She leaned against him, letting the tears finally fall, sobs escaping her lips. The fear, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of loss and discovery poured out in a torrent of emotion. The scent of his cologne, usually comforting, now felt oddly sharp against the salty tang of her tears. I don't know what to feel," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "A sister. I have a sister, and she's carrying our children." The words were a jumbled mess, a reflection of the turmoil within. She felt a pang of guilt, a strange, unexpected guilt, interwoven with relief and joy. The sheer improbability of it all was staggering. A lifetime of yearning fulfilled in the most unexpected way imaginable. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibilities. The ride home, once a blur, was now etched into her memory, a pivotal moment in a life irrevocably changed. The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to amplify the silence. Eleanor stared at the genetic test results, the stark black lettering blurring through her unshed tears. James sat beside her, his hand covering hers, a silent promise of support. The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken anxieties. The scent of antiseptic clashed with the faint floral perfume Eleanor usually wore, now absent, replaced by a strange metallic tang of fear. "Identical?" she whispered again, the word a fragile echo in the suffocating quiet. The implications crashed over her like a tidal wave. Not just a surrogate, a sister, her sister, carrying their children. The weight of this revelation pressed down, a physical burden that stole the breath from her lungs. James squeezed her hand, his touch firm but gentle. "We'll figure this out," he repeated, his voice a low, steady hum against the roaring storm in her heart. He knew the depth of her longing for a child, the years of painful infertility treatments, the quiet desperation that had shadowed their marriage. He understood the profound implications of this discovery, the seismic shift it represented in their lives. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window. The city below, usually a vibrant tapestry of lights, now felt distant, blurred, as if viewed through a hazy lens of disbelief. The city lights mocked her carefully constructed world, a world now irrevocably altered. A lifetime of yearning, of a missing piece she never knew existed, had suddenly materialized in the most extraordinary and terrifying way. "I feel guilty," she finally confessed, her voice cracking. The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. "She's carrying our babies, and And I haven't even met my own sister. A wave of nausea washed over her, a mixture of shock and unexpected grief. The joy of impending parenthood was tangled with a profound sense of loss, a lifetime stolen, a bond severed before it could even begin. James leaned closer, his eyes filled with a deep empathy that transcended words. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch tender and reassuring. "It's okay to feel everything," he whispered, his voice a balm to her wounded soul. "All of it, the joy, the fear, the guilt, it's all valid. We'll navigate this together, the three of us." His gaze held a newfound strength, a determination to face the unknown future, whatever it may hold. The hospital room, once a symbol of hope and expectation, now transformed into a crucible of unexpected revelation, a space where their lives would forever be altered. The future, once a clearly defined path, now branched into an uncharted, uncertain landscape. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming change, the unwavering support of James became a beacon, a steady light guiding them through the storm. The following days were a blur of hushed phone calls and hurried appointments. Sarah, ever practical, focused on her prenatal care, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Eleanor's internal tempest. The sterile scent of the doctor's office, usually a source of hope, now felt suffocating. Eleanor found herself staring at Sarah, her surrogate, her sister, a stranger in a familiar body, searching for any hint of the shared history that lay hidden beneath the surface. "How are you feeling?" James asked one evening, finding Eleanor staring blankly at a photo of their idyllic life pre-surrogacy. A life now irrevocably altered. The photo, vibrant with laughter and sunshine, felt like a relic from a distant past. Eleanor sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken emotions. "Guilty," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I should have known. I should have felt something. Anything. Instead, I treated you like a vessel." James reached for her hand, his touch a comforting anchor. "You didn't know, Eleanor. None of us did. Don't blame yourself. But the twins, they're half-sister, half-niece. It's complicated." She traced the rim of her wine glass, the crystal cold against her skin. The wine, usually a source of comfort, tasted flat, bitter. "Complicated is an understatement," James chuckled wryly, trying to lighten the mood. "But we're facing it together, and we'll figure it out. The three of us." Later, Eleanor found Sarah in the garden, her hands gently stroking the soft petals of a rose. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. The air, thick with the fragrance of blooming jasmine, offered a momentary respite from the turmoil within. Eleanor approached hesitantly, unsure of how to bridge the chasm between them. "Sarah," she began, her voice trembling slightly. She paused, searching for the right words that could possibly convey the avalanche of emotions consuming her. Sarah looked up, her eyes kind, understanding. "I know," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who had already traversed the emotional landscape. "I know you're struggling." A shared silence settled between them, a silence heavy with unspoken questions, unspoken apologies, unspoken hopes. It was a silence that, despite its awkwardness, felt more connecting than any carefully chosen words could have been. The beginning of their journey towards sisterhood, a journey fraught with challenges, but one that promised, however uncertainly, a future interwoven with love and understanding. The following weeks were a blur of appointments and tests, a whirlwind of emotions that left Eleanor breathless. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to her like a second skin, a constant reminder of the upheaval in her life. James, ever the pragmatist, navigated the chaos with quiet competence, scheduling appointments, managing the media inquiries, and acting as a buffer between Eleanor and the increasingly bewildered Sarah. One evening, after a particularly grueling session with the adoption agency, Eleanor found Sarah in the library, surrounded by dusty tomes and yellowed photographs. The room smelled of old paper and leather, a scent that somehow mirrored the weight of their shared past. Sarah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I found this," Sarah whispered, holding out a faded picture of two little girls with identical pigtails and matching dresses. "It's yes, I think." Eleanor's breath hitched. The girls in the photograph were eerily similar to her and Sarah, their smiles mirroring each other. A tangible connection across decades of separation. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the reality of their shared history crashing down with the force of a tidal wave. I don't remember," Eleanor stammered, her voice thick with emotion. The photo felt both familiar and alien, a phantom limb of a life she'd never known. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "Me neither. Just fragments. A feeling of belonging. A sense of loss I never understood until now." A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The only sound was the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick marking the passage of time, a relentless reminder of the years stolen from them. Eleanor reached out, her hand hesitantly touching Sarah's. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of their shared heritage, a fragile bridge across a chasm of lost time. "We'll figure it out," Eleanor promised, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Together, Sarah squeezed her hand, a silent affirmation of their bond, a shared hope for a future they were only just beginning to understand. The journey ahead was daunting, filled with uncertainty and emotional turbulence. But for the first time since the revelation, a glimmer of hope pierced through the darkness. They had each other, and that, Eleanor realized, was a beginning. The adoption agency's office smelled faintly of lemon polish and regret. Rows of sterile filing cabinets lined the walls, each one a silent testament to broken families and shattered dreams. Eleanor sat rigidly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone white. Across from her, Sarah traced patterns on the worn armrest of her chair, her eyes distant, lost in the swirling fog of her rediscovered past. James, a calming presence in his tailored suit, sat between them, his hand briefly resting on Eleanor's before discreetly withdrawing. "The records are incomplete," the social worker, a woman with kind eyes and a weary smile, explained, her voice soft but firm. "There were significant gaps in the paperwork from that time. We have some basic information, but it's not much." Sarah's shoulders slumped. "So, we might never know why they gave us away?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. Eleanor reached across the table, her touch hesitant but genuine. "We'll find out," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The shared uncertainty forged a strange kind of kinship between them, a fragile bond built on the foundation of their shared mystery. The social worker pushed a file across the table. Inside, a single black and white photograph showed a younger Eleanor's mother, a striking resemblance to both Eleanor and Sarah. She also showed them a few legal documents and a handwritten note. "Twins, please keep them together." The implication was chilling, a ghost of a desperate plea that resonated with a deep, unspoken sadness. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of unanswered questions and the ghost of a shared history. The air hung thick with the scent of old paper and unspoken sorrow, a tangible reminder of the years lost and the secrets yet to be uncovered. Leaving the agency, the three of them walked in silence, the city noise a distant hum against the weight of their emotions. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the city in hues of orange and purple, but the colors couldn't penetrate the gloom that enveloped them. It felt like they had uncovered just enough information to uncover their past, and yet still remained just as mysterious. The car ride home was a study in contrasts. James, ever the pragmatist, hummed along to the radio, a cheerful counterpoint to the silence hanging heavy between Eleanor and Sarah. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of color reflecting in Sarah's wide, uncertain eyes. The lemon polish scent from the agency still clung faintly to her clothes, a persistent reminder of their shared, fragmented past. Eleanor, clutching a tissue crumpled in her hand, finally broke the silence. "That note, please keep them together. It's chilling." Her voice was barely a whisper, the words laced with a mixture of fear and fascination. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands. It makes you wonder, what happened? Why were we separated? A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in the dim light of the car. James reached out, his hand covering hers. We'll find out, he reassured, his voice gentle but firm. We'll uncover every piece of this puzzle, together. It'll take time, but we'll do it. His words, though meant to comfort, hung heavy with the unspoken weight of their predicament. The unspoken question lingered. What would happen to their carefully constructed life, now irrevocably altered by this shocking revelation? What would this mean for their hopes of a family? For Sarah? For their unborn children? What would this mean for them all? The city lights seemed to mock their fragility. Bright, dazzling, yet ultimately indifferent to their pain. The silence returned, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers against the falling rain. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. This was Sarah's life too. Her past, her trauma, her secrets, all intertwined with Eleanor's own. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, crushing her with its gravity. She glanced at Sarah, seeing a reflection of her own anxieties mirrored in her eyes. A mix of hope and fear, a fragile new bond emerging from the ruins of their shared history. The journey home, intended to bring comfort, felt instead like a pilgrimage through the landscape of their shared past. A path paved with unanswered questions and the potential for both devastation and breathtaking connection. The rain intensified, mirroring the torrent of emotions sweeping over them, leaving them soaked, vulnerable, and achingly close. The ultrasound room hummed with the low thrum of machinery, a stark contrast to the frantic beat of Eleanor's heart. The technician's cheerful announcement, "It's twins," initially sparked a wave of joyous relief, quickly replaced by a tidal wave of anxiety. The image on the screen, two tiny, flickering heartbeats, felt both miraculous and terrifying. James, ever the calming presence, squeezed Eleanor's hand. His touch, usually a source of comfort, felt strangely inadequate against the enormity of their newfound reality. "Two," he murmured, his voice laced with awe and a hint of apprehension. The increased risk, the doubled financial burden. It all crashed over Eleanor in a dizzying wave. "But the money," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. The carefully constructed plan, the meticulously saved funds, all felt suddenly insufficient. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, amplifying her pre-existing anxieties. She pictured the sleepless nights, the mountains of diapers, the constant demands of two newborns. Panic tightened its icy grip. James's gaze held hers, a silent reassurance in his steady eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his voice a balm against her rising panic. "We always do. We'll face this together, just like we've faced everything else." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of her fear. Later, in the sterile quiet of their car, the initial joy had faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Eleanor stared out the window, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of worry. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and the looming shadow of the genetic testing yet to come. The twins' future, their own future, it all hung precariously in the balance. The lemon-scented air freshener, a futile attempt to mask the lingering antiseptic smell of the clinic, only served to highlight the fragility of their happiness. The unspoken question loomed. Were they truly ready for this? For two? The genetic counselor's office felt colder than the outside autumn air. Eleanor clutched James's hand, its warmth a small island in a sea of icy apprehension. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a constant reminder of the fragility of their hope. Across the small, polished table, the counselor, a woman whose face held a practiced neutrality, placed a file on the desk. The crispness of the paper felt almost mocking in its stark contrast to the tremor in Eleanor's hands. "The results are unconventional," the counselor began, her voice carefully modulated. Eleanor's breath hitched. James squeezed her hand tighter, his silent reassurance a lifeline. "Unconventional," Eleanor echoed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. The counselor cleared her throat. The DNA analysis reveals a remarkably high degree of genetic similarity between the surrogate, Miss Sarah Walker, and yourself, Mrs. Hayes. In fact, the probability of this occurring randomly is statistically insignificant. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Eleanor felt a cold dread creep up her spine, a primal fear that defied logic. James's grip tightened, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension. What are you saying?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. The lemon-scented hand lotion she'd applied that morning now felt greasy and suffocating on her skin. The counselor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We believe further investigation is necessary. We've contacted a specialized adoption agency. They specialize in cases of separated twins." The drive home was a blur. The city lights, usually a mesmerizing spectacle, were now a distorted, meaningless wash of color. Silence hung between them, a vast and chilling emptiness. Eleanor stared out the window, the image of two tiny, flickering heartbeats on the ultrasound screen seared into her mind. The joy, the fear, the overwhelming uncertainty. It all coalesced into a dizzying vortex of emotion. Finally, James broke the silence, his voice low and hesitant. "Twins, separated at birth. It's unbelievable." He reached for Eleanor's hand again, his touch hesitant, searching for connection amidst the storm raging within them both. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of disbelief. Their meticulously crafted future, their carefully constructed plan, it all felt shattered, replaced by a daunting, unknown landscape. The scent of the air freshener, once a comforting routine, was now a cruel reminder of their naivete. Their journey to parenthood had taken an unexpected, shocking turn, leading them down a path far beyond their wildest imaginings. The ultrasound room hummed with a low, mechanical thrum, a stark contrast to the frantic beat of Eleanor's heart. Two tiny, flickering shapes pulsed on the screen, a double echo of the joy and fear swelling within her. "Twins," the technician announced, her voice neutral. Yet the word hung in the air, charged with implications. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She looked at James, his face a mixture of stunned surprise and cautious optimism, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "Twins," Eleanor repeated, the word a breathless whisper. The initial elation warred with a sudden, chilling wave of anxiety. Double the joy, yes, but also double the responsibility, double the financial strain. Her carefully constructed plan, her meticulously managed pregnancy, now felt utterly destabilized. The drive home was a silent testament to their unspoken anxieties. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, mirroring the chaotic thoughts swirling in Eleanor's mind. She felt the weight of the news pressing down, a suffocating blanket of responsibility. James, sensing her distress, reached over and gently took her hand. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." His words, though intended to soothe, only amplified her unease. Together, would their carefully constructed relationship withstand the strain of unexpected twins and the burgeoning financial and emotional burdens they presented? That night, nestled in their meticulously designed, minimalist bedroom, the silence was heavy with unspoken fears. Eleanor stared at the ceiling, the soft glow of the bedside lamp unable to pierce the darkness in her heart. The scent of lavender, usually a comforting aroma, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the fragile peace she was desperately trying to maintain. "I'm scared, James," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The admission broke the dam of her carefully constructed composure. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and prickly. James pulled her close, his embrace a haven in the storm of her emotions. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with empathy. "But we'll do this, together." His words were a lifeline, a promise of unwavering support. Yet, even his comforting presence couldn't fully alleviate the gnawing uncertainty that lingered. The arrival of twins, a blessing tinged with a bitter aftertaste of fear and doubt, marked a turning point, a new chapter in their journey, one they had never anticipated, and one that was about to become exponentially more complex. The following days were a blur of appointments, anxious phone calls, and hushed conversations. The stark white walls of the fertility clinic seemed to amplify Eleanor's rising panic. The scent of antiseptic and the low hum of machinery became a constant, unsettling soundtrack to her unease. James, ever the pragmatist, tried to maintain a calm exterior, meticulously researching options, compiling spreadsheets detailing potential costs. But even his methodical approach couldn't mask the underlying tremor of worry in his voice. "We need to talk about the genetic testing," he said one evening, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. They sat on their plush sofa, the soft cashmere a stark contrast to the harsh reality they faced. The city lights twinkled outside, their beauty a cruel irony to Eleanor's internal turmoil. Eleanor flinched. The thought of genetic testing, already fraught with the potential for complications, now felt even more daunting. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. The familiar sound, usually comforting, now felt like a relentless countdown. "It's important," James continued, his voice gentle but firm. He reached for her hand, his touch a lifeline in the sea of her anxieties. "For the babies, for us, for Sarah." The mention of Sarah shifted something within Eleanor. A pang of guilt pricked at her, a subtle reminder of the woman carrying her and James's future children. Sarah, with her unwavering kindness and quiet strength, had become a part of their lives, a silent participant in their desperate quest for parenthood. But now, with the looming prospect of twins, the equation had become infinitely more complicated. The financial implications alone felt insurmountable. The emotional weight, the sheer scale of what lay ahead, threatened to crush her. "What if something is wrong?" Eleanor asked, the question barely a whisper, yet heavy with unspoken fears. The image of the two tiny, flickering shapes on the ultrasound screen burned into her memory, a constant source of both joy and dread. James pulled her closer, his embrace both reassuring and protective. "We'll face whatever comes," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of comfort against the storm raging within her. "Together." But the unspoken question hung between them, a silent, ominous presence in their meticulously crafted haven. Could their relationship truly withstand the storm that was brewing? The arrival of twins, a miracle tinged with anxiety, had irrevocably changed everything. The sterile scent of the clinic clung to Eleanor like a second skin. Each passing day felt heavier, the anticipation a tangible pressure in her chest. The genetic test results were promised within the week, a week that stretched before her like an endless desert. James, ever practical, immersed himself in spreadsheets, calculating costs, contingency plans. But his carefully constructed calm couldn't quite mask the tremor in his hand as he sipped his lukewarm tea. "It feels surreal," Eleanor murmured, staring out at the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked window. The usually comforting glow felt cold and distant tonight. James sighed, his gaze meeting hers across the expanse of their luxurious living room. "Surreal is an understatement. Twins. And now this." He gestured vaguely towards the results envelope sitting unopened on the coffee table, a stark white rectangle in the dimly lit room. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock, each beat a tiny hammer blow against Eleanor's growing anxiety. The soft cashmere throw draped across their knees did little to alleviate the chill that settled deep within her bones. What if something's wrong?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The fear, once a lurking shadow, now loomed large, casting its pall over their carefully constructed future. James reached for her hand, his touch grounding her in the present. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together, just like we've faced everything else." His words were meant to be comforting, but a faint undercurrent of doubt ran beneath the surface. The infertility struggle, the desperate pursuit of parenthood, it had strained their marriage, creating fissures that even their wealth couldn't quite paper over. This new uncertainty, this potential seismic shift, threatened to shatter what fragile peace they had managed to build. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her knuckles bone-white. The twins, those two flickering shapes on the ultrasound screen, seemed both a miracle and a potential disaster. The weight of their impending arrival, coupled with the unknown of the genetic testing, felt almost unbearable. She loved James, fiercely and desperately, but the fear of losing him, of losing their carefully constructed world, clawed at the edges of her mind. The hope that had once shone so brightly was now clouded by an overwhelming wave of dread. The waiting, this agonizing period of suspense, was proving more agonizing than she had ever anticipated. The week crawled by, each day a leaden weight on Eleanor's chest. The sterile white envelope sat on the coffee table, a silent judge of their anxieties. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness in the otherwise pristine air of their apartment. James, usually a bastion of calm, paced restlessly, his phone a constant companion, a futile attempt to distract himself from the ticking clock of anticipation. "I can't stop thinking about it," Eleanor confessed, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in the dryness of her throat. She traced the delicate pattern of the Persian rug with a trembling fingertip, the intricate weave a stark contrast to the chaos within her. James stopped pacing, his gaze soft as he knelt beside her. He gently took her hand, his touch a grounding presence in the storm raging within her. "I know, sweetheart, but we'll know soon," the doctor said, "early tomorrow." He tried to sound reassuring, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his own apprehension. The infertility battles had left scars, deep fissures in the foundation of their relationship, masked by wealth and privilege but always present, a simmering tension beneath the surface. The twins, the genetic testing threatened to expose everything. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of her fear momentarily easing. The city lights, once cold and distant, now seemed to hold a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise in the face of the unknown. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind a damp chill and the faint, sweet scent of petrichor. "What if they aren't healthy?" she breathed, her voice choked with unshed tears. The image of those two tiny shapes on the ultrasound screen, a miracle and a potential heartbreak, flickered in her mind. James pulled her closer, his embrace both comforting and protective. "We'll face whatever comes," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm against her fear. "We'll face it together. Always." His words were a lifeline, a promise, but even he couldn't completely quell the growing unease. The unopened envelope, a constant reminder of the unknown, pulsed with a silent threat, casting a long, unsettling shadow over their future. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight, the weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating as the scent of lilies. The silence, once a comfortable companion, now pressed in on them, a suffocating blanket of dread and anticipation. The sun, a pale disk behind the swirling city smog, cast long shadows across the sterile white walls of the clinic. Eleanor clutched James's hand, her knuckles bone-white. The air hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken anxieties. Inside, the doctor's voice, though calm, held a clinical edge that grated on Eleanor's frayed nerves. The words "identical twins," "genetic match," and "separated at birth" echoed in the hushed space, each syllable a hammer blow to her already shattered composure. James squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering, offering a silent promise of support. He'd seen the cracks in Eleanor's carefully constructed facade widen during the months of infertility treatments, the desperate hope battling the gnawing fear. This revelation, this impossible twist of fate, threatened to shatter everything. Outside, the city hummed with its usual frenetic energy, a stark contrast to the numb silence that had enveloped Eleanor. She stared blankly at the bustling street, the faces a blur, each person a life she'd never shared, a life her sister had lived without her. The doctor's words played on repeat in her mind, a dissonant melody of disbelief and longing. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a cold trail against the warmth of James's hand. It's Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the vast emptiness that had suddenly consumed her. The name, once a neutral identifier, now pulsed with a fierce, inexplicable connection, a recognition that transcended logic and reason. James pulled her close, his embrace a comforting haven in the storm of emotions raging within her. He didn't need words. His presence, his quiet strength, spoke volumes. He knew this was more than just a medical anomaly. This was a seismic shift in their lives, a revelation that would redefine their family, their past, and their future. The journey home was a blur, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, the sounds of traffic muted, replaced by the deafening silence of Eleanor's internal turmoil. The silence was broken only by the occasional choked sob escaping her lips, and James's soft, reassuring murmurs. He knew the path ahead would be challenging, filled with unforeseen obstacles and emotional complexities. But as he looked at Eleanor, her face etched with a mixture of shock, grief, and a flicker of nascent hope, he knew they would face it together, just as he had promised. The weight of the future, though heavy, was not as heavy as the unspoken longing that had now, unexpectedly, found a voice. The sterile white of the clinic faded into the warm, familiar glow of their apartment. Eleanor sank onto the sofa, the plush cushions offering little comfort. The city's relentless hum, previously a background noise, now felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. James moved silently, fetching water, then settling beside her, his hand finding hers. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the ghost of the doctor's words. I can't process it," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice cracking. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her cheeks. The carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for so long crumbled, revealing the raw, vulnerable woman beneath. James pulled her close, his embrace a haven. "It's okay, Eleanor. We'll figure this out together. It's a lot to take in." His voice was gentle, reassuring, yet a hint of his own bewilderment seeped through. This wasn't the future they'd planned, the carefully orchestrated path to parenthood. This was a whirlwind, a chaotic storm that threatened to sweep them away. Eleanor shuddered, pulling away slightly. "Twins? My twin? Carrying my children? Feels wrong, James. So incredibly wrong." She stared at her hands, twisting her fingers, the diamond on her ring catching the light, a stark contrast to the turmoil within. "It's not wrong, Ellie," James said softly, his gaze unwavering. "It's extraordinary. And Sarah, she's been nothing but kind, nothing but wonderful." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We need to be there for her, too. She's carrying our children, and now, she's your sister." A low sob escaped Eleanor. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her. The years of longing for a child, the struggle with infertility, now overshadowed by this unbelievable twist of fate. The longing for a sister she never knew she had now mingled with the joy and terror of impending parenthood. The scent of the lilies James had placed on the table, intended as a gesture of comfort, suddenly felt heavy, cloying. The apartment, once a sanctuary, felt suffocating, the silence teeming with unanswered questions. The future, once a clear, albeit challenging path, was now shrouded in uncertainty, a dense fog obscuring the way forward. The only certainty was James's hand in hers, a grounding force amidst the chaos. Their journey to parenthood had taken a detour, a breathtaking, terrifying, and profoundly unexpected one. Adoption Agency's office felt colder now, the sterile scent of disinfectant sharper, amplifying the tremor in Sarah's hands as she held a tiny, worn teddy bear. It was identical to one in Eleanor's childhood photographs, a faded, almost ghostly image of a giggling girl clutching a similar toy. A wave of nausea, a strange mixture of shock and grief, washed over Sarah. The past, once a vague ache, now pulsed with a painful clarity. I remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock on the wall. The bear felt strangely warm in her grasp, a tangible link to a life she'd never known. Tears streamed down her cheeks, blurring the already faded colors of the photograph. Eleanor, her face pale but strangely calm, reached across the small table, her hand covering Sarah's. The touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement of a lifetime of unspoken longing finally finding its voice. "Me too," Eleanor murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Fragments, flashes. A recurring dream of a woman with your eyes." James watched them, his heart aching with a mixture of wonder and sorrow. He'd braced himself for shock, for anger, even denial. But this quiet, shared grief was something deeper, more profound. He saw in their shared gaze a history stretching back decades, a silent conversation spanning a lifetime of separation. The social worker, a woman with kind eyes and a weary expression, cleared her throat. She handed Eleanor a file, its contents outlining a story of parental struggles, a desperate choice, and a devastating separation. The details were sparse, the language clinical, but the underlying sorrow was undeniable. The agency's attempts to locate the parents had been unsuccessful, the records incomplete. "They loved you both," the social worker said softly, her voice a gentle balm to their raw wounds. "They made the hardest choice imaginable, believing it was for the best." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah looked from the worn teddy bear to Eleanor, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding. What if they regretted it?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The question hung between them, a silent testament to the complexities of their newly discovered familial bond, a fragile bridge built on a foundation of loss and longing. The weight of their shared past pressed down on them, but amidst the sorrow, a flicker of hope ignited the promise of a future where the pieces, once scattered, would slowly, painstakingly, begin to fit together. The air in the adoption agency's archives hung thick with the scent of aging paper and forgotten dreams. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy window panes, illuminating the faded photographs scattered across the table. Eleanor traced a finger across a picture of a laughing baby, its face a blurry echo of Sarah's. A pang of guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced her. This wasn't just about reuniting with a sister. It was about facing a past she'd never known, a past that shaped the woman standing across from her. Sarah, clutching the worn teddy bear, stared at a faded postcard showing a beach, the handwriting illegible, the image blurred by time. This is all there is?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The fragility of the connection, the vast chasm of lost years, threatened to overwhelm her. Eleanor reached across the table again, her hand finding Sarah's. "It's a beginning," she said, her voice soft but firm, trying to project an assurance she didn't entirely feel. The shared touch, however tentative, sparked a flicker of recognition. A shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them, transcending words. James, watching from the periphery, felt a surge of protective instinct. He'd expected drama, recriminations, perhaps even anger. This quiet, shared grief was somehow more powerful, more poignant. He saw the pain etched on both their faces, the years of loss echoing in their eyes. The social worker, her expression sympathetic, presented a fragmented family tree, a timeline punctuated by gaps and unanswered questions. A trail of cryptic letters, faded photographs, and fragmented memories, the raw material of a life stolen, a family fractured. The weight of it settled heavily on them. The past, once a mystery, now threatened to consume them. But in the shared sorrow, a new bond, tentative and fragile, began to form. The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Could they rebuild a relationship built on the ruins of a lost past? The answer, it seemed, lay not in the documents before them, but in the uncertain future they faced, together. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Sarah's skin, a stark contrast to the floral perfume Eleanor wore. Sarah sat on the edge of the hospital bed, clutching a worn, faded photograph, a blurry image of two toddlers, identical smiles mirroring each other. It felt surreal, holding a picture of herself and Eleanor, a life she'd never known existed. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, a physical burden that stole her breath. "It's a lot to process," Sarah finally whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The rhythmic beeping of the fetal monitor filled the silence, a stark reminder of the two lives growing inside her, lives inextricably linked to the twin sister she'd just discovered. Eleanor, her face etched with a mixture of joy and apprehension, sat beside her, her hand hovering over Sarah's. "I know," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I never imagined." She trailed off, the enormity of their shared history and the unexpected future unfolding before them evident in her eyes. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent witness to their shared vulnerability. "I feel responsible," Sarah continued, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "For you, for the babies, for everything." The fear in her voice was palpable, a raw, exposed nerve. She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a complex mix of fear and longing. "What if I can't be a good sister, a good aunt?" Eleanor squeezed Sarah's hand, her touch conveying a depth of understanding that transcended words. "You are already both," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "We'll figure this out together. We have to." A genuine smile, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, played on her lips. It was a smile born of shared pain and a burgeoning hope, the shared experience of the past, the daunting prospect of their new reality. It was a bond forged in the crucible of an extraordinary circumstance. The fear remained, but so too did a dawning recognition of a connection far deeper than blood. The twins' shared heartbeat, a constant, steady rhythm in the background, seemed to underscore the unspoken promise of a future they would navigate together. The adoption agency's office felt cold, despite the cheerful floral wallpaper. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the gloom, illuminating the faded photographs lining the walls, smiling children, hopeful parents, promises whispered and broken. Eleanor shivered, pulling her jacket tighter, the scent of old paper and stale air filling her nostrils. Sarah sat beside her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles bone white. The caseworker, a woman with kind eyes and a weary smile, placed a file on the table. "This is all we could locate," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioner. Records were incomplete. The agency was much smaller than, less stringent record-keeping. Eleanor traced a finger along the brittle edges of a faded photograph, a younger version of herself, beaming, holding a teddy bear almost identical to the one Sarah clutched earlier in the hospital. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the past and present blurring into a disorienting kaleidoscope of emotions. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the image further. "There's a locket mentioned here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "A heart-shaped locket, with initials inside." Eleanor gasped, a memory surfacing, a fleeting image of a locket, a lost treasure from a childhood she never knew she'd shared. A shared past, a shared loss, suddenly making terrifyingly tangible sense. The caseworker nodded, producing a small velvet box. Inside, nestled on faded satin, lay a tarnished silver locket. Inside, the engraved initials, AM and SM. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotion, the weight of their shared history pressing down. Sarah reached for the locket, her fingers trembling. Opening it, a tiny, faded photograph tumbled out. A picture of two smiling babies, their faces identical to Eleanor's and her own. The tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks, hot and unstoppable, mirroring Eleanor's own silent weeping. The shared grief, the shared loss, the sudden, overwhelming joy of rediscovery created a bond stronger than either could have anticipated. This wasn't just about the babies anymore. It was about them, about two halves of a whole finally finding their way back to each other. The weight of their shared past pressed upon them. A shared burden suddenly transformed into a shared strength. The adoption agency's sterile scent clung to Sarah like a second skin. The faint antiseptic tang mixed with the musty odor of aging files, creating a strangely unsettling aroma. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, filtered through the grimy window panes, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Sarah traced the worn grooves of the locket's tarnished silver, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth blooming in her chest, a confusing mixture of fear and exhilaration. "It's surreal," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. Her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth, were clouded with a deep uncertainty. Eleanor sat beside her, her hand resting gently on Sarah's arm, a silent gesture of comfort. Eleanor's own emotions were a tempest. The weight of revelation pressed down, the years of longing and infertility dissolving into a bewildering sense of reunification. The discovery of her twin sister, the surrogate carrying her children, felt both miraculous and deeply unsettling. "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice husky with unshed tears. "It feels like a lifetime has been compressed into this one moment." She squeezed Sarah's hand, the simple gesture speaking volumes of unspoken understanding and nascent sisterhood. The caseworker, a woman whose face held the etched wisdom of countless stories, offered a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice a gentle balm, "life presents us with circumstances we never could have imagined, but these unexpected turns can lead to extraordinary connections." A silence fell, thick with unspoken emotion, the weight of their shared history heavy in the air. Sarah looked at the faded photograph of two identical babies, a mirror image of their current selves. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The hospital, the ultrasound, the joyous anticipation. It all seemed to shimmer on the periphery, replaced by a new and overwhelming reality. This wasn't just about carrying Eleanor's children anymore. This was about discovering her own lost identity, her own stolen history. And the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What would this mean for her life? For the babies? For Eleanor? "I'm scared," Sarah finally confessed, her voice trembling. The carefully constructed walls of composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face, hot and uncontrollable. Eleanor reached out, her fingers intertwining with Sarah's. "We'll face it together," she promised, her voice firm despite the tremor in her own hands. The shared trauma, the shared joy, the shared future. It was all binding them together in an unbreakable bond. A new chapter was beginning, fraught with challenges, but also overflowing with the promise of a profound connection. The locket, a symbol of their shared past, lay between them, a tangible link to a future yet unwritten. The adoption agency felt cold, despite the afternoon sun warming the waiting room. Sarah hugged herself, the thin cotton of her sweater offering little comfort against the chill that settled deep in her bones. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, a scent that mirrored the weight in her heart. Eleanor squeezed her hand, her touch surprisingly grounding. "They said they have photos," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The caseworker, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, placed a worn photo album on the table. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed pages, were pictures of two identical infants, each swaddled in a different colored blanket. Sarah felt a tremor run through her, a wave of dizziness threatening to overwhelm her. These babies, these perfect mirror images, were her and Eleanor. Separated at birth, the caseworker explained softly, due to unforeseen circumstances. The records are incomplete. A shared silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall, each second a tiny hammer blow against Sarah's already fragile composure. The photos felt like a punch to the gut, a sudden, visceral reminder of a life she never knew. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "My whole life, it feels like a lie," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of revelation pressed down on her, a crushing burden of unknown years, lost memories, and stolen identity. Eleanor reached across the table, her touch warm and comforting. "It's not a lie, Sarah. It's a missing piece of the puzzle. And now we're finding it together." Her voice trembled slightly, reflecting the turmoil within. Sarah looked at Eleanor, her twin, a stranger, and a sister all at once. A complex tapestry of emotions swirled within her: grief for a lost childhood, fear for the future, and a burgeoning sense of connection to this woman who was both completely unfamiliar and deeply familiar. The babies, Eleanor's babies, their babies, felt like another layer of complicated feelings. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her. What if I can't do this? Sarah's voice cracked. The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. The fear wasn't just for herself anymore. It encompassed the twins, their future, the fragile bond she was just beginning to forge with her sister. The future, once clear and defined, now stretched before her, a vast and uncertain landscape. The scent of chamomile tea hung in the air, a fragile piece in the otherwise chaotic aftermath of their discovery. Eleanor's apartment, usually a picture of minimalist elegance, felt cluttered with the weight of their shared secret. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, mirroring the swirling uncertainty in their hearts. "It's strange," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, picking at a loose thread on her worn jeans. She hadn't slept properly since the revelation at the adoption agency. The shock had worn off, replaced by a creeping unease. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on a framed photo of a laughing child. A child who could have been either of them. More than strange, surreal. She ran a hand through her hair, the gesture betraying the exhaustion etched on her face. Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the soft clinking of spoons against porcelain cups. The awkwardness was palpable, a thick blanket woven from years of separation and the sudden upheaval of their lives. Yet, beneath the awkwardness, a tentative connection flickered. "I keep seeing your face everywhere," Eleanor confessed, a small, self-deprecating laugh escaping her lips. "In shop windows, in crowds. It's like I'm searching for myself, and I keep finding you." A hesitant smile touched Sarah's lips. "I feel the same. It's unsettling, yet comforting at the same time." She paused, her eyes searching Eleanor's. "We missed out on so much." "We did," Eleanor agreed, a catch in her voice. "But we still have each other. And the babies." The mention of the twins brought a shift in the atmosphere, a shared responsibility bridging the chasm between them. The fear in Sarah's eyes lingered, a stark reminder of the emotional roller coaster they were both navigating. Eleanor reached across the small table, her hand covering Sarah's. The warmth of her touch was unexpectedly comforting. "We'll figure this out, together," she promised, her voice laced with a newfound conviction. "Whatever happens, we'll face it as sisters." Sarah squeezed her hand back, a silent affirmation of their fragile bond. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, a silent testament to the long road ahead. But in that shared moment of touch, a flicker of hope ignited, a small ember against the vast unknown. The journey was just beginning, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But they would face them, hand in hand, sisters bound by a shared past and an uncertain future. The aroma of baking bread, a comforting contrast to the storm brewing inside Sarah, filled the small kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams, a scene eerily reminiscent of Eleanor's apartment, a mirror reflecting their shared, chaotic lives. Sarah kneaded the dough, the rhythmic motion a futile attempt to calm the turmoil within. The ultrasound photos lay on the counter, two tiny figures nestled within Sarah's womb, a constant reminder of the life growing inside her, a life inextricably linked to the woman who was both her sister and her employer. Eleanor entered, her face etched with concern. The usual crisp lines of her business suit were softened by worry. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the rhythmic thump of the dough. Sarah sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken anxieties. "Overwhelmed," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the dough. "It's not just the pregnancy anymore, Ellie. It's everything. The past, the future, the twins." A tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail on her skin. "I know," Eleanor said softly, her hand reaching out to cover Sarah's. The simple gesture held the weight of shared history and a hesitant connection that was only just beginning to blossom. The warmth of her touch was a comfort in the face of uncertainty, a bridge built across a chasm of years. It's a lot to process all at once, but we're in this together, remember? We'll navigate this however difficult it may be. Just, let's take it one day at a time. Silence settled between them, a fragile truce in the war within. The scent of baking bread mingled with the unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the air. The rhythmic thudding of the kneading became a shared heartbeat, connecting the sisters in a way words couldn't express. Eleanor picked up one of the ultrasound photos, her fingers tracing the outline of a tiny hand. "They're going to be so beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And they're going to have the most amazing aunts and uncles." A faint smile flickered on her lips, a hint of the woman Sarah had known before the upheaval. Sarah managed a weak smile in return, the warmth spreading slowly through her, a beacon in the darkness. The weight of the situation remained, but in that shared moment, amidst the flour and the rising dough, a tentative sense of unity began to form. They were sisters, reunited by the most unexpected of circumstances, bound by the miracle of life and the shared responsibility of parenthood, a responsibility that was slowly forging a bond stronger than their past separation. The road ahead remained daunting, yet in the small kitchen, bathed in the golden light, a seed of hope had been sown. The aroma of chamomile tea, subtly floral and calming, hung in the air of Eleanor's sun-drenched living room. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Sarah sat perched on a plush velvet sofa, nervously twisting a strand of her hair. The silence, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock, felt heavy with unspoken anxieties. Eleanor, perched opposite her on a matching sofa, sipped her tea, her usual sharp composure softened by a hesitant vulnerability. "It's a lot to take in," Sarah finally said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. The words hung in the air, laden with the weight of their shared history and the uncertainties of the future. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know, more than I ever imagined." She paused, searching for the right words, her eyes mirroring the storm brewing within. "But I'm glad, incredibly glad we found each other." A fragile smile touched Sarah's lips. "It's strange," she admitted, her voice laced with a mix of wonder and apprehension. "To be both your sister and your surrogate. It feels unnatural." Eleanor reached across the space separating them, her hand gently covering Sarah's. The simple gesture held the weight of unspoken emotions, a tentative bridge built across a chasm of years. "It is," Eleanor agreed softly. "Unnatural, yes, but also extraordinary. We're rewriting the rules, Sarah, creating our own family in the most unexpected way imaginable." Sarah looked at their intertwined hands, a silent acknowledgement of the bond slowly blossoming between them. The warmth of Eleanor's touch was a comfort, a counterpoint to the chilling realization of everything they'd both been through. "I keep thinking about the adoption agency," Sarah murmured, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "About all those years lost." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "We'll find out more," she promised, her voice firm yet gentle. "We'll uncover our past, together, and that shared history, as painful as it may be, will become the foundation of our future." The weight of their shared secret, of their shared pain, seemed to lessen slightly in the shared quiet. A small, tentative step toward understanding, toward forgiveness, toward healing. The sunlight continued to pour in, washing over them in waves of warmth, offering a silent promise of a future yet unwritten. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, filled the air of their spacious bedroom. Sunlight slanted across the crisp white sheets, illuminating the slight curve of Sarah's belly. Eleanor sat beside the bed, a worn photo album open in her lap. Pictures of a smiling, younger Eleanor, a child with bright eyes and a mischievous grin, stared back at her. Sarah, hesitant at first, eventually joined her, her fingers tracing the outline of a young girl strikingly similar to herself. "Look," Eleanor whispered, pointing to a picture of a little girl clutching a worn teddy bear. "I remember this bear. Fuzzy, brown. One button I'm missing." Sarah's breath hitched. That's unbelievable," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Tears welled in her eyes. "I had a bear just like that. I don't remember it, but I feel like I do." A wave of shared history washed over them, a silent acknowledgement of a past brutally severed. The album became a bridge, connecting fragmented memories and unspoken longing. They spent hours that afternoon, poring over the photographs, their laughter mixing with tears as they uncovered subtle similarities. A shared crooked smile, the same way they tilted their heads when deep in thought. The shared past, once a source of pain and confusion, was slowly becoming a foundation for their bond. The weight of separation began to lift, replaced by a burgeoning sense of belonging. The lily's fragrance, once a reminder of Eleanor's longing for a family, now felt like a symbol of the unexpected family blooming before them. The afternoon ended with a quiet understanding, a promise of further exploration, and a tentative embrace that held the weight of a lifetime of lost time and a future yet unwritten. The shared journey was just beginning. The following weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, hushed conversations, and stolen glances. James, ever the pragmatist, orchestrated a delicate dance of support. He'd bring coffee and pastries to their early morning appointments, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of their emotions. He'd listen patiently to Eleanor's anxieties, her fear of losing Sarah, her guilt at the circumstances of their reunion. He'd then gently steer the conversation towards Sarah, offering words of encouragement, a reassuring smile, a shared laugh to break the tension. One evening, nestled amongst the plush cushions of their living room, surrounded by the soft glow of a crackling fire, James attempted a family game night. The air hung heavy with unspoken feelings. Sarah, clutching a mug of chamomile tea, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames, watched as Eleanor struggled to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, her usually sharp focus scattered. "Eleanor," James said softly, his voice a warm balm in the quiet room. "It's okay to let go a little. This isn't a competition." Eleanor looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It's not just the puzzle, James. It's everything. I feel like I'm constantly trying to control things, to make sure everything goes perfectly." She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "And Sarah? She's carrying my twins, my sister's carrying my twins." Sarah reached across the low coffee table, her hand covering Eleanor's. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." The touch, gentle yet firm, spoke volumes. It was an unspoken promise, a silent vow of support and shared responsibility. The warmth of Sarah's hand, the comforting presence of James, and the crackling fire softened Eleanor's rigid control. Tears finally flowed, a torrent of release. James' arm encircled Eleanor's shoulders, offering silent comfort. Sarah squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. For the first time, the weight of their complex situation felt less heavy, less insurmountable. The unexpected, heart-wrenching journey of finding a sister had also led to an unlikely, fiercely protective family unit. A family that was still under construction but radiating with the potential for love, understanding, and a shared future. The warmth of the fire reflected the burgeoning warmth in their hearts, a promise of the love and healing yet to come. The aroma of cinnamon and apples filled the air as Eleanor, Sarah, and James sat around the kitchen island, a half-finished apple pie cooling on a wire rack. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The atmosphere, however, remained somewhat strained. The initial euphoria of their reunion was slowly giving way to the complex realities of their situation. "So," James began, his voice carefully neutral, breaking the silence. "The hospital called. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss the birthing plan." Eleanor, who had been meticulously arranging the silverware, flinched. "Already? It feels like just yesterday we were..." Well, yesterday we were dealing with the shock. Her voice was laced with a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. Sarah, who had been quietly peeling an apple, looked up. "It's going fast," she murmured, her eyes distant. The weight of carrying twins, coupled with the emotional turmoil of the past weeks, was etched onto her face. "It is," James agreed, his gaze softening as he looked at Sarah. "But we're doing this together. All three of us. We'll navigate this, however it unfolds." He reached across the island, his hand briefly covering Eleanor's. The gesture, small yet profound, offered a silent reassurance. Eleanor met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. She managed a small smile. "You're right," she whispered. "We are." The admission seemed to unburden her slightly. The air in the kitchen, though still heavy with unspoken anxieties, felt a little lighter. The warmth of the sunlight, the sweet scent of the pie, the quiet support of James, all offered a fragile sense of hope, a tiny crack in the wall of uncertainty that threatened to engulf them. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, they were facing it, together, united not just by blood, but by a growing, if tentative, love. The shared apple pie, a symbol of this fragile unity, remained half-eaten, a testament to the sweetness and challenges that lay ahead. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Eleanor's clothes, a stark contrast to the floral perfume she usually wore. She sat stiffly in the waiting room, the rhythmic ticking of the clock amplifying her anxiety. Each tick was a tiny hammer blow against the fragile hope she clung to. James, sensing her distress, gently squeezed her hand. His touch was a lifeline, grounding her in the present. The ultrasound images, a blur of grays and shadowy forms, swam in her memory. 2 tiny heartbeats, a double dose of joy and terror. "They'll be here soon," James murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble. He knew the silence was worse than any words. He knew the fear gnawing at Eleanor, a fear mirrored in her tightly clenched jaw and the trembling in her hands. He reached for her other hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The simple act felt monumental, a silent vow of unwavering support. Sarah entered, her face pale but serene. The weight of the pregnancy, the emotional upheaval of the past weeks, seemed to rest lightly upon her. She carried herself with a quiet strength that both captivated and humbled Eleanor. The initial shock of discovering their shared blood had faded, replaced by a hesitant, tentative bond. But beneath the surface, a current of unspoken anxieties flowed. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, a hesitant question rather than a confident statement. The question wasn't about the upcoming appointment. It was about facing the future together, about navigating the uncharted waters of their newfound sisterhood. Eleanor nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement. The fear still lingered, a cold knot in her stomach, but James's presence, the gentle pressure of his hand, Sarah's quiet strength, they were a shield against the overwhelming tide of uncertainty. The shared experience, the impending arrival of their nieces, or perhaps, even more profoundly, their own daughters, was slowly forging a connection stronger than the initial chaos of their revelation. The doctor's arrival broke the silence, offering a temporary reprieve from the weight of their unspoken fears, ushering them into a new stage of their journey, a journey towards a future they were slowly, tentatively, learning to embrace together. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and anxiety. Eleanor, usually impeccably dressed, felt the silk of her blouse chafe against her skin, a physical manifestation of her unease. James, ever the pragmatist, flipped through a magazine, his eyes not focusing on the glossy pages. He was acutely aware of Eleanor's silent turmoil. Sarah sat beside them, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her usual calm demeanor subtly frayed at the edges. The weight of the shared secret, the impending births, the nascent sisterhood, it pressed down on them all. "It's almost time," James said softly, his voice a balm against the oppressive silence. He squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent reassurance. Eleanor managed a weak smile. I'm trying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The effort to maintain composure felt monumental. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing Eleanor's arm. The touch was fleeting, but it carried a surprising weight of understanding. "We'll get through this together," she murmured, her voice catching slightly. The shared vulnerability, the unspoken acknowledgement of their intertwined fates, created a fragile bridge between them. The doctor's arrival brought a momentary respite from the tension. The ultrasound screen flickered to life, displaying the familiar blurry images. Two tiny figures, nestled snugly within Sarah's womb, pulsed with life. Eleanor's breath hitched. A wave of emotion washed over her: joy, fear, a profound sense of responsibility, and an unexpected surge of sisterly love. The tiny heartbeats were a symphony of life, a testament to the extraordinary journey they were undertaking. The room filled with a quiet awe as the doctor detailed the baby's development, his words a soothing counterpoint to the whirlwind of emotions swirling within them. As the appointment concluded, a tentative peace settled over them. The shared experience, the tangible evidence of life growing within Sarah, had paradoxically eased some of the tension. Leaving the clinic, the crisp autumn air felt strangely invigorating. James, watching his wife and her twin sister walk side by side, felt a surge of pride and a profound sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with potential challenges, but for the first time, he sensed a genuine possibility of a future where they could truly be a family. The seeds of a bond, planted in the fertile ground of shared trauma and unexpected joy, were beginning to sprout. The clinic's sterile scent faded as they stepped into the crisp autumn air. Leaves, the color of burnt sugar, crunched underfoot. Eleanor, still shaky, leaned heavily on James's arm, the warmth of his touch a lifeline. Sarah walked beside them, her face pale but composed, a quiet strength radiating from her. The twins' heartbeats, a rhythmic drum against the backdrop of their shared journey, echoed in Eleanor's ears. "It's surreal," Eleanor breathed, her voice catching. The weight of her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She glanced at Sarah, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange of unspoken feelings. A fragile connection, forged in the crucible of surprise and shared DNA, began to take root. James squeezed Eleanor's hand, his gaze shifting between them. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice firm, reassuring. He understood the enormity of what they were facing, a pregnancy complicated by an unexpected familial revelation. He was the steady rock in a sea of swirling emotions. They drove in silence for a while, the silence filled only by the gentle hum of the car engine and the rustling of leaves outside. Sarah, breaking the quiet, spoke softly. "I keep thinking about them, you know? The babies. They're our babies. Yours and mine." Eleanor's eyes stung with tears. The word ours resonated with her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. A blend of joy, apprehension, and something else, a budding sisterly love, flooded her. She reached for Sarah's hand, a gesture of unspoken acknowledgement, a silent pact of shared responsibility. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Our babies." The simple phrase held the weight of a lifetime of longing, a lifetime that had culminated in this shared miracle, this unexpected, astonishing sisterhood. The road ahead stretched before them, long and uncertain. Yet for the first time, a sense of hope, fragile but real, began to bloom within her. The shared experience, the tangible reality of the growing life within Sarah, had begun to weave an invisible thread, binding them together, stronger than blood. The following weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, hushed conversations, and stolen glances between Eleanor and Sarah. The waiting room, usually a sterile expanse of pale green, felt strangely comforting, a shared space of anticipation. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint aroma of Sarah's lavender perfume, a comforting contrast to Eleanor's usual anxiety-induced perfume, a sharp citrus. One afternoon, while undergoing a sonogram, Eleanor watched Sarah's face, illuminated by the flickering monitor. The twins, tiny but distinct, moved within Sarah's womb, a silent ballet of life. A tear escaped Eleanor's eye. "They're perfect," she whispered, her voice catching. Sarah smiled, a hesitant, fragile thing. They are, she agreed, her hand resting gently on her belly. It's strange, knowing they're also yours. The weight of that statement hung in the air, heavier than the anticipation of childbirth. Eleanor felt a surge of protective instinct towards Sarah, a complex emotion born of guilt, wonder, and an unexpected love. Later, back in the car, James reached over to place a hand over Eleanor's, a silent gesture of support. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed," he said softly, his voice a balm to her frayed nerves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dashboard, painting the car interior in warm, comforting hues. "I feel guilty," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hired her, used her, and now," she trailed off, unable to articulate the complicated mix of emotions warring within her. "You didn't know," James reminded her gently. "No one could have predicted this. But now you have a chance to build something extraordinary. A family, yes, but also something more profound." He squeezed her hand. "A sisterhood." Sarah, sitting in the passenger seat, remained silent, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. The unspoken question hung between them. Could they truly build this extraordinary thing? The weight of the twins' existence, the shared heritage, the unexpected sisterhood, it felt enormous. A mountain they had yet to begin to climb. But in that moment, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, the impossible felt, just maybe, within reach. The next ultrasound appointment felt different. The sterile scent of the clinic was almost comforting, a familiar backdrop to the burgeoning life within Sarah. Eleanor, usually a whirlwind of anxious energy, sat surprisingly still, her gaze fixed on the monitor as the technician expertly maneuvered the wand. The twins, now more defined, pulsed with life, a mesmerizing dance of tiny limbs and fluttering hearts. A soft gasp escaped Sarah's lips as one twin playfully kicked against her ribs. Eleanor's hand instinctively reached out, covering Sarah's. The contact felt charged, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, their intertwined destinies. The air vibrated with unspoken emotions, a mix of wonder, fear, and a nascent sense of sisterhood that felt both fragile and profound. Later, in the hushed privacy of James's study, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth, Eleanor poured out her anxieties. "I feel like I'm intruding," she confessed, her voice laced with guilt. "This isn't just about the babies anymore. It's about us." James, ever the steady anchor, pulled her close. The warmth of his embrace eased her trembling. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed, Ellie," he whispered, his voice a soothing balm. "But you're not intruding. You're building a family, a completely unexpected one, but a family nonetheless. And Sarah, she's your sister." The weight of that statement hung heavy in the quiet room. The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the lines of worry etched onto Eleanor's brow, the faint crease of concern around James's eyes. He knew this wasn't just about physical parenthood. It was about emotional reconciliation, about building a bond that had been cruelly severed decades ago. A week later, Sarah arrived, her face pale, a tremor in her hands. The joy of the ultrasound was overshadowed by a growing unease. She sat stiffly on the sofa, avoiding eye contact, her usual warm demeanor replaced by a fragile vulnerability. I don't think I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The unspoken weight of the situation pressed down on them. The growing babies, the unexpected sisterhood, the looming anxieties of the future. The words hung in the air, a fragile balloon teetering on the brink of bursting, threatening to unravel the carefully woven threads of their burgeoning family. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. A silent plea for understanding hung unspoken between them, a silent testament to the emotional depth of this extraordinary and challenging situation. The aroma of chamomile tea, a soothing balm against Sarah's frayed nerves, hung in the air of Eleanor's sun-drenched kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Eleanor, usually impeccably composed, sat opposite Sarah, her usual sharp edges softened by worry. Sarah's hands, usually so capable, fidgeted nervously in her lap. The silence, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock, felt heavy with unspoken fears. "It's not just the babies," Sarah finally said, her voice a low tremor. The words escaped, hesitant, like a fragile butterfly taking flight. "It's everything. My life. It's changed so drastically." Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, were clouded with a deep weariness. Eleanor reached across the table, her touch gentle, hesitant. "I know," she murmured, her voice thick with empathy. "And I'm sorry. I never wanted to overwhelm you." She hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the turmoil within her own heart. The weight of her own anxieties pressed down, a burden she couldn't quite shake. Sarah's gaze met Eleanor's, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice catching. "It's just so much. Being a surrogate was one thing. This is different." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, ashamed of her vulnerability. Eleanor squeezed Sarah's hand, offering silent reassurance. The warmth of the contact eased the tension, a shared understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary journey they were navigating together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, the changing light mirroring the shifting dynamics of their relationship. "We'll figure this out," Eleanor said, her voice firm, but laced with genuine concern. "Together, we'll find a way to make this work. For all of us." She paused, searching for the right words that could bridge the chasm of fear and uncertainty that separated them. "Because, Sarah," she continued, her voice softer now, "your family." The unspoken promise in her words hung in the air, a fragile bridge built on trust, empathy, and the shared hope for a future they were just beginning to create. The weight of the situation remained, but now it was shared, a burden lightened by the nascent bond of sisterhood, a bond born from the most unexpected of circumstances. The ticking clock continued its steady rhythm, a reminder that time marches onward, carrying with it the promise of both challenges and triumphs. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Sarah's clothes, a stark contrast to the floral perfume Eleanor usually wore. They sat in the waiting room, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors a low, insistent hum in the background. Sarah's hand, pale and trembling, rested on her swollen belly. The weight of the twins pressed down, a physical manifestation of the overwhelming pressure she felt. "It's not just the appointments," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping. Her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth, were dull with exhaustion. "It's everything. Eleanor, I feel like I'm drowning." Eleanor reached out, her touch hesitant, unsure. She'd spent her life controlling everything. This felt utterly out of her grasp. "I know," she said, her voice husky with unshed tears. "It's a lot, more than either of us could have imagined." She saw the fear in Sarah's eyes, a reflection of her own anxieties. A tear escaped Sarah's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. She swiped at it quickly, embarrassed by her vulnerability. Eleanor squeezed her hand, offering a silent apology for the burden she'd inadvertently placed on her sister. The doctor entered, his face grave. The ultrasound images flickered on the screen, a silent testament to the life growing inside Sarah. The room fell silent, the beeping of the monitors fading into the background. He spoke in clinical terms, explaining potential risks, outlining necessary precautions. But Sarah heard only the undercurrent of worry in his voice, the unspoken fears that echoed her own. Later, back in Eleanor's opulent living room, the tension hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The champagne glasses, left untouched on the coffee table, seemed to mock their strained silence. The soft glow of the fireplace couldn't warm the chill that had settled between them. "I feel used," Sarah finally said, her voice breaking, "like a vessel, not a person." The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Eleanor flinched, the accusation hitting its mark. She'd been so focused on her own desires her own anxieties, she'd failed to see Sarah's struggles. The weight of her guilt pressed down, heavy and suffocating. "I understand," Eleanor said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "And I'm truly, deeply sorry. I didn't see." She reached out, her hand finding Sarah's, her touch laced with genuine remorse. "We'll figure this out," she vowed, her voice firm, yet filled with the uncertainty that mirrored Sarah's own fear. Together, the unspoken promise hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, a testament to the nascent bond between two sisters, forged in the crucible of an unexpected pregnancy and a lifetime of separation. The fight for their family had just begun. The following weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, ultrasounds displaying two tiny, flickering heartbeats, and hushed conversations laced with anxiety. The opulent nursery, once a symbol of Eleanor's carefully planned future, now felt suffocating, its pristine perfection mocking the chaos swirling within. Sarah, usually so composed, retreated into herself, her vibrant spirit dimmed by the weight of her unexpected role. The scent of lavender from Eleanor's aromatherapy diffuser did little to soothe the tension hanging heavy in the air. One evening, nestled on Eleanor's plush sofa, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle scattered between them, Sarah confided, her voice barely a whisper. "I keep seeing her face, you know? In the mirror, in my reflection. It's unsettling." Her fingers traced the outline of a faded photograph, a shared childhood memory unearthed from the adoption agency's files. A picture of two identical little girls. Eleanor, her own eyes filled with unshed tears, reached for her sister's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, their intertwined fates. James, ever the pragmatist, tried to offer support, orchestrating family therapy sessions, arranging for a doula specializing in high-risk pregnancies, and gently mediating the simmering tension between the sisters. He found himself caught in the undertow of their shared history, navigating his love for Eleanor with a growing affection for Sarah, a silent witness to the unfolding drama of their lives. He saw their individual struggles and sensed the growing understanding that was slowly bridging the distance between them. The rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to emphasize the passage of time, the pressure building towards the inevitable arrival of the twins. The weight of their shared secret, the revelation of their twinhood, hung over them all, a constant reminder of their extraordinary circumstances. Sarah's fear was palpable, not just of childbirth, but of the future, of the unknown path ahead. Eleanor, for all her strength and control, was beginning to understand the depth of her own inadequacies, her own role in exacerbating Sarah's fears. They were two sides of the same coin, bound together by genetics and circumstance, yet miles apart in their experiences and emotional landscapes. The chasm between them felt vast, yet the beginnings of a bridge, fragile as it was finally being laid. The air in the prenatal yoga class hung thick with the scent of lavender and sweat. Eleanor, usually so meticulously composed, found herself struggling to keep pace, her breath catching in her chest. Beside her, Sarah, surprisingly adept, moved with a fluid grace that belied her anxieties. The soft glow of candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, highlighting the stark contrast between their outward calm and the turmoil within. After class, they sat on the worn wooden floor, sipping chamomile tea. The silence, initially comfortable, quickly became strained. "It's a lot," Sarah finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Eleanor reached for her sister's hand, her touch tentative. "I know," she said softly. "It's more than I ever imagined, more than either of us imagined." The weight of their shared secret, the unexpected pregnancy, the revelation of their twinhood, it pressed down on them, a shared burden. Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their mutual struggle. "I feel used," she confessed, her eyes welling up, "like a vessel, not a person. And the guilt of feeling this way." Her voice cracked, the unspoken words hanging between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Eleanor winced, the sting of Sarah's words cutting deep. "I understand," she whispered, her own eyes brimming with tears. I haven't been easy. I've been so focused on the babies, on the plan. I haven't seen you, Sarah. I haven't really seen you. A tear escaped Sarah's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. You wanted a child so badly, Eleanor. And you got two. But at what cost? Her voice was laced with pain, a raw honesty that stripped away years of polite distance. The aroma of chamomile tea suddenly felt cloyingly sweet, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of their unspoken resentments. Eleanor pulled her sister closer, the warmth of their embrace a small comfort against the chill of their unspoken fears. We'll figure it out, she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. Together, we have to. The weight of the unspoken promise hung between them, a fragile bridge built on shared pain and a tentative hope. The future remained uncertain, the path ahead fraught with challenges. But in that shared moment, a flicker of understanding, of genuine connection, ignited between them. The lavender scent of the yoga studio lingered in the air, a faint reminder of the journey that still lay ahead. The sterile white of the doctor's office felt colder than usual. Eleanor clutched a tissue, its dampness mirroring the tremor in her hand. Sarah sat beside her, radiating a quiet tension that vibrated in the air, thick as the antiseptic smell. The ultrasound images, a blur of grainy black and white, seemed to mock their anxieties. They're growing beautifully, the doctor said, her voice a soothing balm against the storm brewing inside Eleanor. But the words failed to quell the unease. The joy of the impending births felt overshadowed by a looming chasm between the sisters. I don't know how to be both your sister and your benefactor, Eleanor finally confessed, her voice cracking. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken guilt. Sarah looked away, her gaze fixed on the faint lines etched into the worn wooden armrest. Benefactor? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. It feels wrong, like I'm renting out my body, my life. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. The quiet intensity of Sarah's words struck Eleanor harder than any outburst. The weight of her actions pressed down, suffocating her. She hadn't just hired a surrogate. She'd unwittingly exploited her own twin. The realization stung, raw and bitter. I understand, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. I've been so self-absorbed, so focused on having children. I haven't considered your feelings, your life. She reached across, her hand covering Sarah's. The touch was tentative, uncertain, but filled with a genuine desire for connection. It's not just the babies, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. It's everything. Finding out about you, about us. It's been overwhelming. And now, this, carrying your children, sharing this life. It's more than I ever bargained for. Eleanor squeezed her hand, feeling the tremor in Sarah's grip. And yet, here we are, she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips. Sisters, and soon, aunts. We can't undo the past, but we can build a future. Together. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the office equipment. The unspoken understanding hung in the air, a fragile bridge built on shared pain and a tentative hope. The future still held uncertainty, yet in this shared moment of vulnerability and honesty, a new chapter began. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, they were facing it together. The afternoon sun slanted through the living room window, painting dust motes dancing in the golden light. Eleanor sat curled on the sofa, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold beside her. The silence, usually a comfort, felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken words. Sarah paced restlessly, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her bare feet against the hardwood floor a counterpoint to Eleanor's quiet despair. It's not just about the money, Ellie, Sarah finally said, her voice tight with unshed tears. The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. It's about everything. My life, my body, my future. It feels like I've been used. Eleanor winced, the sting of Sarah's words sharp and accurate. She hadn't considered it that way, hadn't truly grasped the depth of Sarah's sacrifice, her feelings of exploitation. Guilt gnawed at her, a bitter taste on her tongue. She looked up, her eyes welling. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I haven't been fair. I've been so focused on getting what I wanted. I haven't seen you. I haven't seen your pain." She reached out, her hand finding Sarah's. Sarah's fingers, usually warm and comforting, were cold, stiff with resentment. "It's not just the pregnancy," Sarah continued, her voice catching. "It's finding out about you, about us, about being separated all these years. It's everything. It's like my whole life has been a lie." She pulled her hand away, turning to stare out the window, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion and grief. The golden light seemed to mock her pain. Eleanor rose, her movements slow and deliberate. She crossed the room and knelt beside Sarah, her hand resting gently on her sister's arm. The warmth of her touch seemed to finally break through the wall of Sarah's bitterness. "I know," Eleanor repeated softly, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm so sorry. I understand if you need space, if you need time." She paused, searching for the right words. "But I also need you to know that I want to make this right. I want us to be sisters, truly sisters, not just surrogate and client." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Sarah finally turned, her eyes red-rimmed, filled with a mixture of hurt and dawning understanding. The anger hadn't vanished, but the sharp edges had softened. A flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, sparked in her gaze. The long silence that followed was not heavy with unspoken words, but filled with the unspoken promise of healing, of rebuilding a bond shattered by decades of separation. And now, slowly, painfully, being pieced back together. The journey was long, arduous, but for the first time, they were facing it, together. The scent of lavender and chamomile hung heavy in the air, a calming balm against the storm raging within them. Eleanor, her face etched with exhaustion, sat opposite Sarah, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on their faces. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the crackling flames. Sarah's hands, usually deft and capable, lay clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. I understand," Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The words felt brittle, fragile, like ice about to shatter. "I understand the desperation, the years of trying." Eleanor nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The years of longing, the crushing weight of infertility, the relentless pressure, it all crashed down on her, a wave of overwhelming grief. "But that doesn't excuse how I behaved, how I treated you. It's not just about the treatment, Ellie," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about everything. The loss, the stolen years, the fact that my life, my body, became your shortcut to motherhood. And then to find out, you're my sister." She laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "It's absurd." The firelight illuminated the raw pain in Sarah's eyes, a stark contrast to the gentle warmth of the flames. Eleanor reached across the small space separating them, her hand covering Sarah's. The contact sparked a jolt, a recognition of their shared history, their shared pain. "I know," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "And I am so incredibly sorry. I didn't see you, Sarah. I was so blinded by my own desire, my own desperation." Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand, the pressure surprisingly firm. "I'm scared, Ellie. Scared of what this all means. For me, for the babies." Her voice faltered, the weight of her fears pressing down on her. I need time." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "You have it, all the time you need. But I hope you'll let me be a part of it. A sister, a support, not just a client." The unspoken promise hung in the air, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of pain and misunderstanding. The journey ahead remained long and arduous, filled with uncertainties and challenges. But in the shared silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, a tentative hope blossomed, a fragile seed of forgiveness taking root in the fertile ground of their newfound connection. The healing process had begun. The morning light, pale and hesitant, filtered through the gauzy curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor woke with a start, the remnants of the previous night's turmoil clinging to her like a damp shroud. Sarah's words, "I'm scared," echoed in the quiet room, a stark counterpoint to the chirping of unseen birds outside. Guilt gnawed at her, a persistent ache in her chest. She found Sarah in the kitchen, the scent of brewing coffee a weak attempt to mask the underlying tension. Sarah stood rigidly by the counter, her movements precise, almost mechanical, a stark contrast to her usual easy grace. The pregnancy glow seemed dimmed, replaced by a fragile pallor that worried Eleanor. "Morning," Eleanor said softly, her voice raspy from disuse. Sarah turned, her gaze distant, her eyes betraying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Morning." The single word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to ease the turmoil within. I've been thinking about what you said last night." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "About being scared." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the swirling steam rising from her mug. "I am. About everything. The babies, of course, but about us. About becoming a family I never knew existed. And then, this. It's overwhelming." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. Eleanor crossed the room, placing a hand gently on Sarah's arm. The touch sparked a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding that transcended the recent conflict. "I know," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a lot to process, and I know I haven't made it easy." Sarah looked at Eleanor, her eyes searching, questioning. "You haven't, but I also know you're trying." Her voice was barely a breath, yet it held a fragile strength that surprised Eleanor. "And that means something." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of the immense journey ahead, a journey they would face, together. The first tentative steps towards healing had been taken. The road ahead remained long, but for the first time, they were walking it side by side. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room, painting the plush carpet in stripes of gold and amber. Eleanor sat opposite Sarah, a half-finished cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside her. The air hung heavy with the unspoken, a fragile truce after their tumultuous confrontation. The scent of lavender from a nearby diffuser did little to soothe the lingering tension. Eleanor watched Sarah, her twin sister, her surrogate, the mother of her soon-to-be-born nieces or nephews. Sarah's hands, usually restless, lay clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in the Persian rug. "I understand," Eleanor began, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. "I understand how overwhelming this must feel. I haven't been easy." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes, the same startling blue as Eleanor's, filled with a weariness that tugged at Eleanor's heart. "It's not just the pregnancy, Ellie," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "It's everything. Finding out we're twins, losing our childhood, the way things happened, and now, this us trying to be a family." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, mirroring a tear Eleanor fought back. "We've both been through so much," Eleanor said, reaching across the space between them, her hand hovering over Sarah's. Sarah didn't flinch. Eleanor's fingers brushed Sarah's, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and a tentative step toward reconciliation. The touch sparked something within them, a recognition of a bond that went beyond circumstance, a connection forged in shared DNA and now strengthened by shared trauma. "I never meant to hurt you," Eleanor continued, her voice cracking. "I was so desperate, so focused on having a child that She trailed off, overcome with emotion. The weight of her actions, the selfishness of her desires, crashed down on her anew. Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand. "I know," she said softly, a gentle understanding in her voice that surprised and comforted Eleanor. But it's not about blame. It's about healing, about figuring out how to be sisters, how to be a family. It's terrifying and wonderful, all at once. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy with unspoken words, but filled with the unspoken understanding of shared experience. A sliver of sunlight pierced through the gloom, illuminating the delicate gold band on Sarah's finger, a small, quiet symbol of hope amid the chaos. The air felt lighter, the tension easing, replaced by a fragile hope. The path ahead was still unclear, still fraught with challenges. But for the first time, they faced it together, sisters, bound not just by blood, but by a newfound understanding and a shared desire for healing. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of antiseptic that usually clung to the hospital rooms. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Eleanor sat beside Sarah's bed, holding her sister's hand, its skin still pale from the ordeal of childbirth. Sarah slept, her face peaceful, a faint smile playing on her lips. The twins, nestled in separate bassinets, gurgled softly. Eleanor traced the delicate veins on Sarah's hand, her own heart aching with a mixture of relief and guilt. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, guilt, and finally, a tentative acceptance. The confrontation had been raw, honest, and utterly necessary. Sarah had finally articulated the profound sense of violation she'd felt, the way Eleanor's desperation had overshadowed her own needs and feelings. A quiet sob escaped Eleanor's lips. James entered the room quietly, a cup of tea in his hand. He placed it gently on the bedside table and sat beside Eleanor, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. The warmth of his presence was a comfort, a silent affirmation of his unwavering support. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion, glancing at Sarah. "And the babies, they're perfect." James nodded, his eyes filled with love and admiration for both women. "They are," he agreed softly. "And so are you both." He squeezed Eleanor's shoulder gently. "You faced some hard truths, Ellie. You admitted your mistakes and you're trying to make amends. That's more than most people can do." Eleanor looked up at him, gratitude washing over her. "I still feel awful," she confessed. "But Sarah, she's trying. She really is." James smiled, a knowing expression in his eyes. "Healing takes time, but you're building something incredibly special here, Ellie. Something stronger than either of you could have imagined." He paused, his gaze falling on the sleeping twins. "A family." The weight of those words settled heavily on Eleanor. Family. A family forged not in traditional lines but in unexpected connections, in shared trauma, and in the enduring power of forgiveness. The road ahead would certainly be challenging, filled with new hurdles and complexities. But for the first time, Eleanor felt a deep sense of hope, a quiet understanding that they would face it together, sisters, mothers, and a family bound by an extraordinary shared journey. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, but the darkness held no fear now, only the promise of a new dawn, a new beginning. The hospital room hummed with a quiet energy, a counterpoint to the storm raging inside Eleanor. Sunlight, filtered through the gauzy curtains, painted the room in a soft, ethereal glow. The scent of antiseptic was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the subtle floral fragrance of the lilies James had brought. Sarah, pale but peaceful, slept beside her newborn twins. Eleanor watched them, her heart a tangled knot of guilt and love. "She's exhausted," James whispered, his hand resting gently on Eleanor's back. The touch was reassuring, a silent anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. I don't know what to say to her." The confrontation had left raw wounds, though a fragile bridge of understanding had begun to form. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. "It wasn't about the babies, Eleanor. It was about you completing yourself." "Say what you feel," James replied, his voice calm and steady. "Tell her how sorry you are, how much you appreciate her sacrifice. and how much you value her now as your sister." Eleanor swallowed, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft gurgling of the twins and the rhythmic beeping of a monitor. The weight of her actions pressed down on her desperation, her lack of consideration for Sarah's feelings. She needed to show Sarah that she understood the depth of her hurt. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Sarah's cheek. The skin was cool, delicate. A single tear traced a path down her own cheek. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I was so consumed by my own desire, my own pain, that I didn't see you, didn't listen to you. I treated you, not as my sister, but as a means to an end." A flicker of movement. Sarah's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze meeting Eleanor's. The look in her eyes was complex, a mixture of weariness, pain, and something akin to forgiveness. "I know," Sarah murmured, her voice weak but clear. "But you didn't know. Not then." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "But I do now, and it changes everything." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. A promise of a different future, a commitment to a bond stronger than the initial circumstances that brought them together. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a silent testament to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one filled with the promise of healing, family, and the unwavering power of sisterhood. The sterile scent of the hospital room clung to Eleanor like a second skin. Sunlight, fractured by the blinds, cast shifting shadows across the pristine white sheets. Sarah slept, her face pale but serene, cradling one of the twins. The other, a miniature replica of his mother, nestled beside her. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor provided a steady, almost comforting backdrop to the tense silence. Eleanor watched, a wave of guilt washing over her. James's hand found hers, his touch a grounding presence in the emotional maelstrom. She felt the rough texture of his calloused thumb against her skin, a familiar comfort. "She needs rest," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, her throat thick with unshed tears. The weight of her actions, her self-absorbed desperation, pressed down on her. She had used Sarah, her own sister, a fact that still felt surreal, as a vessel for her own desires. The realization was a searing brand on her conscience. I want to apologize," Eleanor finally managed, her voice barely a breath. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to repair the damage she had inflicted. James squeezed her hand, encouragement in the gesture. "Tell her what's in your heart. Let her know you understand." She looked at Sarah, the woman who had given her everything, who was now, astonishingly, her sister. The sight of her sleeping peacefully, her face etched with the exhaustion of childbirth, sent another wave of remorse through Eleanor. Sarah's vulnerability pierced through Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses. Slowly, tentatively, Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing against Sarah's soft cheek. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open, meeting Eleanor's gaze. The look in those eyes was a complex tapestry of pain, weariness, and a fragile hope. "Sarah," Eleanor began, her voice trembling, "I am so deeply sorry. I was so consumed by my own needs, my own pain, that I was blind to yours. I treated you not as my sister, but as a means to an end. I never should have done that." Sarah's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I know," she whispered, her voice raspy, "but you didn't know. Not then." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, hot and stinging. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a promise of a different future, a commitment to a bond stronger than the initial circumstances that had brought them together. The shared experience of motherhood, the revelation of their shared past, and the raw honesty of their confrontation were forging something profound, something that transcended their initial pain. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and rose, a silent witness to the fragile beginning of their healing. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Eleanor, a stark contrast to the comforting aroma of chamomile tea James had brewed. Sunlight, filtering through the gauzy curtains, painted dancing motes in the air. Sarah sat by the window, cradling one of the twins, her face etched with a quiet exhaustion that tugged at Eleanor's heart. The tiny infant, a mirror image of Sarah, stirred, nuzzling against her mother's chest. "He's so small," Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. The fear that had gripped her for months, the fear of failure, of not being a good mother, seemed to lessen, replaced by a burgeoning wave of protective tenderness. James sat beside Eleanor, his hand resting reassuringly on her knee. He'd been the steady anchor in their tumultuous journey, a silent bulwark against the emotional storms. "They're both perfect," he murmured, his gaze softening as he watched Sarah. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft sighs of the sleeping infant and the distant hum of hospital machinery. The guilt gnawed at Eleanor, sharp and persistent. It wasn't just the exploitative nature of her initial actions. It was the years of loneliness, the desperate yearning for a child that had blinded her to Sarah's intrinsic worth. Eleanor reached for Sarah's hand, her touch hesitant. Sarah looked up, her eyes, those remarkably similar, incredibly familiar eyes, filled with a mixture of weariness and something that looked like forgiveness. "Sarah," Eleanor began, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I need to say something." Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent invitation to continue. The unspoken acknowledgement of shared pain hung heavy in the air, a palpable connection forged in the crucible of their shared experience. "I know I haven't been good," Eleanor confessed, her voice breaking. "I was so focused on having a child. I didn't see you, didn't see the person you are. I treated you as a means to an end. And that was unforgivable." A single tear traced a path down Sarah's cheek. She brushed it away, her expression unreadable. The intensity of the emotion hanging between them was almost suffocating. "It wasn't malicious," Sarah finally said, her voice low and husky. "I knew the risks. I understood why you did what you did." She paused, her gaze dropping to the sleeping infant in her arms. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't painful. It doesn't mean it wasn't wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared past and the fragile promise of their future. The unspoken understanding, the tacit forgiveness, was the first step on a long and arduous journey of healing. A journey that would require patience, understanding, and the unwavering support of James, the anchor in their turbulent sea. The twins, sleeping soundly in their mother's arms, seemed to represent the fragile hope for a future where their family, however unconventional, would find solace and strength in their newly forged bonds. The hospital room, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, felt oddly peaceful. The rhythmic rise and fall of the twins' breaths created a soothing counterpoint to the city's distant hum. Sarah, cradling one of the newborns, gazed at him with a tenderness that stole Eleanor's breath away. The infant, a miniature replica of both sisters, stirred, his tiny hand instinctively clenching around a finger. "He looks just like you," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The weight of her actions, the initial coldness of her pursuit, pressed down on her. The guilt was a physical entity, a heavy cloak she couldn't seem to shed. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And you, too," she replied, her voice husky with exhaustion and a profound emotion Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. "He has your chin." James, ever the pragmatist, moved to the bedside, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He's perfect," he murmured, his voice a balm to Eleanor's frayed nerves. His gaze shifted to Eleanor, a silent reassurance passing between them. The unspoken understanding of their shared journey, their shared pain, settled over them like a comforting blanket. I don't deserve this," Eleanor choked out, the words catching in her throat. The truth hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. The sterile scent of the hospital room couldn't mask the raw honesty of the moment. Sarah looked at Eleanor, her gaze intense, a lifetime of unspoken longing reflected in those familiar eyes. "You're his aunt," she stated simply, her voice quiet but firm. "And I needed you to be more than that." The confession hung between them, delicate as a newborn's sigh, yet heavy with the weight of their history. The unspoken question hung in the air. Could they bridge the chasm between them, build a true sisterhood amidst the chaos? Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling slightly, covering Sarah's. The contact was electric, a shock of recognition, a silent apology, a hesitant promise. The unspoken words vibrated between them. Regret, forgiveness, hope. The twins, oblivious to the emotional maelstrom swirling around them, slept on, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison, symbols of the fragile, nascent family they had unwittingly created. The journey would be long and fraught with challenges. But in this moment, a fragile seed of hope had been planted, promising a future where forgiveness could blossom. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the faint sweetness of baby powder. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor sat beside Sarah, the twins nestled in bassinets between them. A palpable tension hung heavy, a silent aftermath of the previous night's emotional explosion. Sarah, exhausted but peaceful, gently stroked the cheek of one of the newborns. Her expression was soft, a stark contrast to the turmoil she'd shown just hours before. Eleanor watched her, guilt gnawing at her. She'd been so focused on her own desires, so blind to Sarah's vulnerability. "He's perfect," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice hoarse. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even, facing the enormity of her sister's sacrifice. Sarah looked up, a flicker of a smile gracing her lips. "They both are," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "And I'm glad." The unspoken "glad you're here" hung between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their past. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the gentle sounds of the newborns. Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering over Sarah's. This time, there was no hesitation. Their fingers intertwined, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and nascent healing. James entered the room, a tray laden with steaming mugs balanced precariously in his hands. He moved with a quiet grace, his presence a comforting anchor in the emotional storm. He placed a mug before each woman, the warmth radiating outward, mirroring the slow thaw in their relationship. "Tea?" he asked softly, his eyes conveying more than his words ever could. He understood the delicate balance they were attempting to maintain, the fragile peace they were so carefully crafting. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on Sarah. The shared trauma had forged a bond, undeniable and profound. There were still mountains to climb, still bridges to build, but in this moment, the weight of their burden felt a little lighter. The unspoken promise of a future filled with shared laughter and sisterly love shimmered in the soft light of the hospital room, fragile yet enduring. Their journey was far from over, but they were finally, truly, together. The days that followed were a blur of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and the hushed whispers of new parents. The hospital room, initially a stage for high drama, transformed into a sanctuary of quiet exhaustion. Eleanor, her initial anxiety replaced by a tentative peace, found herself drawn to Sarah, a pull stronger than any blood tie she'd previously known. The twins, two miniature versions of them both, were a constant source of wonder and shared responsibility. One evening, after the twins were finally asleep, a rare silence descended upon the small apartment Eleanor and James had rented near the hospital. The scent of lavender from a calming diffuser mingled with the faint smell of baby milk. Sarah sat on the sofa, cradling a soft, worn teddy bear, a relic from her rediscovered past. "I found this in the box from the agency," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It feels familiar." Eleanor sat beside her, the warmth of James's hand resting on her shoulder a comforting weight. "Me too," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the bear's faded eyes. "It's like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." A comfortable silence settled between them, a silence filled with the unspoken weight of shared history and newfound kinship. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the raw emotion on their faces. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing against Sarah's. This time, There was no hesitation, only a quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly, "for everything, for pushing you, for not seeing you." Sarah looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and forgiveness. "I understand," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I was scared, overwhelmed, but I'm glad it happened this way. We found each other." James squeezed Eleanor's shoulder gently. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but in this moment, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their makeshift family, he saw the glimmer of a future brimming with love, healing, and the enduring strength of sisterhood. The fear and uncertainty still lingered, like shadows at the edge of the light, but the love radiating between the sisters was a beacon, guiding them towards an uncertain but hopeful tomorrow. The air crackled with a newfound understanding, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of unexpected connections. The journey had just begun, but for the first time, they were truly inextricably together. The scent of chamomile tea hung in the air, a calming counterpoint to the storm brewing within Sarah. Sunlight streamed through the window of the small, rented cottage, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Eleanor sat opposite her, a fragile peace settling on her usually sharp features. The twins, nestled in their bassinets, gurgled softly, a soothing soundtrack to their fragile truce. "I know I haven't been easy," Eleanor began, her voice catching slightly. The confession hung in the air, heavy with unspoken apologies. She picked at a loose thread on her worn cardigan, a nervous habit she hadn't realized she'd developed. Sarah met her gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and understanding. "Easy isn't exactly the word I'd use to describe the past few weeks," she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. The tension, however, hadn't completely dissipated. The air still thrummed with the residual energy of their recent arguments. "But I understand," Sarah continued, her voice softer now. "The shock, the fear, it was a lot to process. Finding out you had a twin sister who was also carrying our children, it was overwhelming." She paused, taking a slow sip of her tea. The warmth seemed to soothe her, a visible relaxation spreading across her shoulders. Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, Sarah. I was so consumed by my own desires, my own anxieties. I didn't see you, didn't listen. I just took." Shame colored her voice, a raw honesty that stripped away her usual polished facade. The silence that followed was not awkward, but pregnant with unspoken understanding. The chamomile scent seemed to deepen, its calming influence spreading like a warm blanket. Outside, a robin sang a cheerful melody, a stark contrast to the emotional weight in the room. Yet, the bird's song felt somehow appropriate, a gentle reminder of life's persistent beauty, even amidst the storms. "It's not just about the babies, is it?" Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about all of us, finding our place, our identity, in this unexpected family." Eleanor reached across the small table, her hand covering Sarah's. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, their shared pain, and their blossoming sisterhood. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "It's about us." The weight of her past actions, her past anxieties seemed to lift, replaced by a growing sense of peace and shared purpose. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, bathing them in a warm, golden light. In that shared silence, a powerful bond was forged, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the unexpected joy of finding family in the most unlikely of places. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Eleanor's skin, a lingering ghost of the delivery room. Holding one of the twins, a tiny girl with Sarah's eyes, a wave of overwhelming love washed over her. She glanced across at Sarah, cradling their son, his tiny fingers curled around her finger. Sarah's face, usually so bright, held a quiet exhaustion, yet a profound sense of peace radiated from her. The harsh fluorescent lights of the maternity ward seemed to soften, their brightness dimmed by the golden glow of new life. "They're perfect," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tears welled, not just tears of joy, but tears of profound relief and a burgeoning understanding. Sarah smiled, a gentle, weary smile that reached her eyes. "They are," she agreed, her voice soft. "Absolutely perfect." She looked at Eleanor, a hesitant question in her gaze. I think I understand now," she began, her voice slightly trembling. "About everything. The pressure, the fear. I was afraid of losing myself." Eleanor reached out, her hand covering Sarah's. The touch was more than physical. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared pain, of a journey navigated together. "I know," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion. "I was so focused on wanting a child, on having a family, I forgot about you, about what this all meant for you." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It hummed with unspoken understanding. The rhythmic gurgling of the twins created a calming backdrop, a comforting lullaby against the backdrop of their shared history. The window, previously overlooked, now drew their attention. A soft twilight painted the sky, the colors mirroring the complex emotions filling their hearts. "It's different now," Sarah said, her gaze falling to the sleeping infant in her arms. "It's not just about the babies anymore. It's about us, about our family." Eleanor nodded, a tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "It's about us," she repeated, the words resonating with a newfound clarity. A sense of purpose forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. The weight of her past anxieties began to lift, replaced by a quiet joy, a profound sense of connection that transcended the extraordinary circumstances of their shared journey. The twins, nestled peacefully in their bassinets, seemed to symbolize this newfound unity, this unexpected family forged in the fire of an unexpected pregnancy and a long-lost sisterhood. The twins into their cribs, a quiet understanding hung in the air. The path hadn't been easy, but they had found their way, not merely to a family, but to something deeper, more profound. A sisterhood forged in the crucible of unexpected circumstances, a love that transcended blood and circumstance, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their journey had just begun. The following spring, sunlight streamed through the nursery window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Eleanor, cradling Mia, watched Sarah patiently coaxing Leo into accepting his first sippy cup. The scent of baby powder and blooming jasmine hung in the air. A year had passed since the twins' birth, a year of adjustments, of laughter mixed with exhaustion, of a bond forged in the fires of an extraordinary circumstance. "He's stubborn, just like his Aunt Eleanor," Sarah chuckled, her voice husky with sleep-deprived affection. A faint tremor in her hands betrayed the underlying fatigue. Motherhood, she discovered, was a relentless but rewarding marathon. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "He takes after his father's side of the family. Remember James's determination to get us that appointment with the fertility specialist." A shared look passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past, the anxieties that had once overshadowed their lives. The memory served as a stark contrast to the present, a testament to the profound transformation they had undergone. Later that afternoon, James arrived home, his briefcase in hand. The twins erupted into delighted squeals at his arrival, their tiny hands reaching for him. He knelt, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he enveloped them in a hug. The picture was idyllic, a family portrait woven from unexpected threads. Yet, behind the idyllic facade, a subtle tension remained. "Sarah, we need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice hesitant, as she settled onto the sofa, Mia nestled securely in her arms. The light in the room seemed to dim slightly, anticipation hanging heavy in the air. The conversation was about Sarah's upcoming photography exhibition, a significant step towards reclaiming her independence, a step that both thrilled and unnerved Eleanor. The undercurrent of their discussion revealed a deeper fear, the fear of losing Sarah, of the delicate balance of their newly formed family being disrupted. The unspoken question lingered, Could this unconventional family truly last? The answer lay in their ability to navigate the complexities of their shared history, their individual aspirations, and the enduring power of their unique bond. The warmth of the spring sunshine offered a sliver of hope, a promise that even amidst the inevitable challenges, their journey as sisters, as family, had only just begun. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the kitchen, a comforting counterpoint to the simmering tension. Eleanor, meticulously arranging tiny carrots on Mia's plate, watched Sarah wrestle Leo into his high chair. A year had passed, blurring the lines between chaos and contentment. The initial euphoria of the twins' arrival had settled into a comfortable rhythm, punctuated by the occasional squabble over diaper changes and feeding schedules. "He's getting so big," Sarah murmured, her voice a soft sigh against the backdrop of Leo's gurgles. She glanced at Eleanor, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Time flies," Eleanor agreed, her voice catching slightly. She felt a familiar pang of anxiety, a shadow of the fear that had once consumed her. Would this fragile equilibrium shatter? Could they truly maintain this unconventional family? Later, nestled on the sofa, surrounded by the scattered paraphernalia of parenthood, Eleanor broached the subject. "Your exhibition, it's next week, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. "Yes, it's a lot." "I know," Eleanor said softly, reaching out to cover Sarah's hand. "But you deserve this, Sarah. You deserve everything you've worked for." Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken fears. Eleanor squeezed Sarah's hand, offering a silent promise of support. The fear remained, a subtle tremor in the air, but it was tempered by a deeper understanding, a shared journey that had forged an unbreakable bond. The warmth of the fire, the comforting weight of the twins sleeping upstairs, solidified the feeling of a family built on unexpected circumstances and an enduring strength. The future held uncertainties, but for now, in the quiet intimacy of their shared space, there was only peace. Their journey had just begun.